Augustus ruled Rome for more than 40 years and built the system that turned a chaotic republic into a lasting empire. He didn't just win battles, he rebuilt cities, rewrote rules, and managed his public image so well people practically saw him as Rome's brand manager. Think of it like renovating a messy apartment. He fixed the roads and water, cleaned up the paperwork, and plastered his face on coins so everyone remembered who was in charge. Watch this video to learn how his moves changed everyday life in ancient Rome and what simple leadership lessons you can steal for today, whether you run a team, a campaign, or just want to win your neighborhood debate. First, I'll keep things in plain language. Pax Romana just means a long stretch of relative peace, share a few surprising stories and a bit of ancient gossip, and even throw in some humor, because Augustus would have appreciated good PR as much as anyone. Stick around and you'll see how one man's choices still shape cities and politics centuries later. Rome on the eve of crisis. The governing system in Rome had become a tangle of competing authorities that struggled to solve everyday problems, and that breakdown created real, visible strain on the city and its people. Senators who once met to deliberate now found themselves outmaneuvered by ambitious generals and loud public leaders who used crowds to get what they wanted. Ordinary citizens felt the mismatch in simple ways: unstable grain supplies, delayed pay for soldiers, and courts that favored the wealthy. It was like a workplace where the manager refuses to set rules while department heads hire their own private security. Nothing runs smoothly. Large landowners expanded their estates, often called latifundia, buying up small farms and putting slaves to work instead of free laborers. Smallholders who lost their plots moved to the city searching for work and ended up depending on public grain distributions. Think of a baker who loses his shop to a supermarket chain and then lines up for a loaf paid for by the local council. That shift swelled Rome's population, strained housing and food supplies, and made politics more about keeping an increasingly hungry crowd happy than about long-term planning. Politicians found it useful to promise free wheat or gladiatorial games, because when people are hungry they pay attention to the one who fills their belly. Armies no longer answered only to the state. Generals paid, fed, and promised land to their veterans, and soldiers returned personal loyalty to those commanders rather than to Rome as an institution. A soldier might follow his general across a campaign for the same reasons a modern employee sticks with a boss who pays well and helps them after a layoff. That personal bond turned generals into powerful political players who could march their forces into the city and change governments by force. At the same time, the province administration was rife with private contractors, publicani, who collected taxes and often squeezed more from locals than was fair, sending wealth back to Rome and inflaming tensions abroad. Public life grew rough and noisy. Political disagreements increasingly spilled into violence in the streets and courts, and norms that once restrained elites eroded. Political clubs and gangs pushed agendas by intimidation. Elections were bought and contested with threats as often as with speeches. The result was a cycle: unrest made strongmen look appealing, and strongmen made norms weaker. A pinch of dark humor helps explain it. What had been a polite argument among toga-clad gentlemen slowly resembled a quarrel at a neighborhood bar that ends with someone taking the chairs. The cumulative effect of economic displacement, military loyalty shifts, and rampant corruption left the Roman system brittle and primed for someone who could promise order and pay the bills. Gaius Octavius, Origins and Early Years. He came from Velletri, a compact town south of Rome, where his family belonged to the equestrian class, comfortable, well-connected, but not at the very top of Roman society. His father served as a provincial governor and managed a respectable public career before an early death, which left the household without its main protector. His mother, Asia, was a member of the Julii family through a close branch, and that kinship would later change everything for him. Small-town roots, plus a whisper of powerful relatives in the capital, made for an unusual mix of modesty and opportunity. Schooling for him followed the pattern of ambitious Roman boys: rhetoric, Greek language, and moral training designed to make a public man. Rhetoric simply means learning to speak well in public, the ancient equivalent of joining a debate club, taking acting classes, and practicing presentations until you can persuade a roomful of people. He spent time away from home studying in a Greek-speaking coastal city, where young Romans often learned manners, language, and how to handle an audience. Think of it as an old-school semester abroad focused on persuasive speech. Those lessons mattered. Later, the ability to craft words and appear confident would be as useful as any sword. Family dynamics did a lot of the shaping too. Losing a father who held office meant the family had to lean on maternal relatives and social ties for protection and advancement. Being the great-nephew of a major political figure made him both lucky and vulnerable at once. You get the network, but people also start expecting things from you. In practical terms, this meant more letters, more introductions, and more pressure to learn how to navigate Rome's clubs, salons, and political dinner tables. It's the ancient version of having a relative with a corner office who can shuttle you into meetings, useful, but awkward at Thanksgiving. Personality traces show someone alert to opportunity and careful with appearances. He was not a rowdy country boy, rather, he absorbed books, manners, and the social codes of elite Roman life, while still keeping a provincial plainness that proved useful later when people needed to like him. Simple habits, polished speech, quick study of rivals, and a knack for turning introductions into alliances, were built early. A little humor always helped. He could smile through compliments and cut through awkwardness, the kind of social skill that today would make you the person everyone remembers after a networking event. Julius Caesar's heir, adoption and ambition. Julius Caesar made a decisive legal move when he named his young relative as his adopted son and heir in his will, giving that boy not just a name but a legal claim and a public brand. The adoptee took the family name, adding Caesar to his own, and that single change turned a private kinship tie into an open invitation to power. In Roman law, adoption carried real weight. It conferred rights to inheritance, recognition by institutions, and a clear place in the chain of command. Think of it like being written into the shareholder agreement of a major company overnight. You inherit the stock, the office keys, and the expectations. That legal boost mattered because power in Rome depended on more than blood, it depended on recognition. The new heir used the famous name like a megaphone. He gathered support by reminding people of Caesar's achievements, issuing public gestures that connected him to his adoptive father, and by courting the veterans who had fought under Caesar and trusted the familiar standard. He turned a family connection into a political brand, similar to how someone today might take over a well-known family business and lean on the brand to win over customers and partners. Small-town example, a kid gets the keys to the family bakery and suddenly the whole block treats them differently, same bread, but the name on the door changes everything. Ambition moved quickly from symbolic to practical. The heir formed strategic partnerships with powerful figures, sharing both spoils and responsibilities when it suited him. He was willing to show mercy to some and stark decisiveness to others. Generosity could win hearts, and harsh measures could remove obstacles. In modern terms, he negotiated alliances like a CEO arranging mergers, sometimes cooperative, sometimes cutthroat. There were public displays designed to sway opinion, legal maneuvers to secure authority, and decisive military backing to settle disputes. Picture a new executive who first promises continuity, then restructures the company to lock in control. Same idea, different era. He also understood image and timing. Ceremonies, gifts to the populace, and careful messaging created a sense that he was the natural continuation of the late leader's work, even while he quietly concentrated power. That combination of legal entitlement and relentless ambition turned a personal inheritance into a political revolution. In everyday life you might see this in family-run politics or dynastic businesses. Someone inherits a famous name and then, through a mix of charm, hard work, savvy deals, and occasional ruthlessness, expands that legacy into something far larger. It's like getting the keys to a beloved restaurant and, within a few years, owning the whole chain, except with more speeches and fewer aprons. The assassination and political upheaval. A brutal act in the Roman Senate shattered the old order and sent shockwaves through the city, as a group of senators stabbed Julius Caesar to death because they feared one man had too much power. That killing did not restore the Republic, instead it set off a scramble for control, with Caesar's adopted heir stepping into a political and military maze he had not expected. Octavian arrived not as an instant ruler but as a young, determined relative with a legal claim, and he had to learn fast how to turn grief and anger into authority. Think of it like a family business where the founder is suddenly gone and a distant relative shows up with the will, but the boardroom has swords instead of signatures. Alliances shifted quickly. 3 men, Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, formed a formal partnership to hunt down the assassins and secure power, and they used harsh measures to eliminate rivals and stabilize the situation. Proscriptions, lists of enemies who could be killed or dispossessed, made the streets dangerous and emptied many estates. Ordinary people woke up one day to find neighbors vanished and property redistributed. It's similar, in a very rough way, to a political purge in modern terms. Loyalty mattered more than law, and fear became a tool for consolidation. Military battles followed, and the remaining leaders of the assassination plot were defeated, but the alliance that had won together did not last long. Rivalry and rivalry's trappings came next. Antony's partnership with a foreign queen created a propaganda goldmine for Octavian, who painted himself as the defender of Roman values and used public opinion like a modern campaign manager uses headlines. He even had Antony's will read aloud to the people to suggest scandal and disloyalty. It worked because Romans cared deeply about tradition and family honor. The split evolved into personal, political, and cultural war, where marriages and rumors mattered almost as much as legions. You can compare it to a political campaign that hinges on scandal and media spin. The facts matter, but the story told to the public can be decisive. The final showdown came at sea, where Octavian's forces scored a decisive victory and left his rivals with few options. With Antony and his ally gone, Octavian moved from being the strongest man in a fragile coalition to being the undisputed head of Roman politics. He then reshaped institutions to make stability permanent, reorganizing the army, curbing political violence, and arranging governance so rebellions were less likely. It was a practical end to prolonged chaos, a single ruler who promised order and delivered it, even as that concentration of power erased the old republican freedoms. In everyday terms, it's the difference between a chaotic shared household where everyone argues about everything and a single, strict householder who pays the bills on time. You get peace, but you also give up some independence. The second triumvirate emerges. After Julius Caesar's murder, 3 powerful men joined forces and set up a legal, extraordinary arrangement to take control of the Roman state. Octavian, the young adopted heir of Caesar, stood beside Mark Antony, the experienced general and politician, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a respected commander who brought legitimacy and resources. They were given sweeping authority by law. Think of it as 3 emergency managers handed the keys to the city so they could act fast, and they used that power to reshape politics and the army. It was not a casual handshake pact, it had formal backing and clear aims, to restore order, punish the assassins, and stabilize Rome's fractured institutions. Power was divided among them in a practical, almost bureaucratic way. Antony took charge of the eastern provinces and their armies. Octavian focused on Italy and the western territories. Lepidus held Sicily, Sardinia, and Africa, along with control of some key veteran settlements. This split resembled managers divvying up departments, each with budgets and staff, so they could act simultaneously on different fronts. They could draft laws, command armies, and confiscate property without the usual Senate delays. That concentration of power made quick decisions possible, but it also removed many of the checks that usually slowed leaders down. One of their first and bloodiest tools was a system of proscriptions, public lists of enemies whose lives and property were forfeit. Names were posted in the streets, rewards were offered for capture or killing, and estates were seized to raise money for the legions. Cicero, whose speeches had attacked Antony, ended up on those lists and paid with his life. To understand it in ordinary terms, picture a hostile corporate takeover where certain executives are not only fired but publicly vilified, their pensions taken and their houses auctioned off. Now multiply the cruelty and add soldiers. The proscriptions funded veteran settlements and solidified loyalty, but they also spread fear and made long-lasting enemies. Military action followed political measures, with the triumvirs moving to crush the faction that had killed Caesar. Their coordinated campaigns brought decisive victories against the leading assassins, and those triumphs tied together military force and political legitimacy. Short-term unity held because each man needed the other's resources and standing. Yet behind the scenes ambition brewed. Allies today could be rivals tomorrow, and the alliance's structure made that outcome likely. The triumvirate's emergence therefore marked both an efficient emergency government and the beginning of a shifting power struggle that would eventually concentrate authority in one's hands. A messy, dramatic start, equal parts legal maneuvering, battlefield muscle, and cold political calculation. Proscriptions and consolidation of power. After Caesar's murder, Octavian joined with two rivals to form a powerful political team that legally unleashed lists of enemies whose property could be seized and whose lives were forfeit. These lists, called proscriptions, named men who were outlawed and made it safe for bounty hunters and political enemies to kill, exile, or confiscate the goods of those on the list. One well-known victim was the orator Cicero, whose death and the public display of his head and hands became a grim sign of how ruthless the politics had become. The goal was blunt: eliminate opponents, raise cash, and reward loyal followers. Confiscated property supplied the quick money armies and allies needed. Think of it as an emergency fundraiser, but with swords instead of bake sales. Wealth taken from the proscribed was used to pay soldiers, buy loyalty, and redistribute land to veterans. That redistribution did more than settle old debts. It created a base of people who owed their new homes and pensions to Octavian's generosity, and who therefore had a personal stake in his survival and success. Simple favors and big land grants were a potent combination. At the same time, Octavian began reshaping institutions in ways that concentrated real authority while keeping a familiar outward shape. He accepted public offices and honors in sequence rather than seizing a single crown, and used those legitimate powers to control the army and the flow of money. He maintained the language and rituals of the old system, but the practical levers, who commanded the legions, who had the purse strings, who could call assemblies, were firmly in his hands. It was like a company manager who keeps the CEO title but lets everyone else keep their business cards. Clemency and public works then softened the image. After crushing physical opposition, he offered pardons and positions to many former enemies, and invested in building projects and religious ceremonies to win public favor. This mix of hard measures and charm offensive helped normalize his authority. For a modern comparison, imagine a politician who first eliminates rival power bases, then hires those same rivals back as consultants, and finally funds playgrounds and parades to make people forget the messy purge. Security and trust were reinforced by creating personal guards and settling veterans close to the capital and in frontier provinces. Those troops were loyal to him personally rather than to the old republican state, which made rebellion riskier and loyalty more reliable. Agricultural settlements for veterans also tamped down potential unrest in the countryside, because people with a stake in peace are less likely to support chaos. In short, removal by force was followed by rewards and integration. All of this combined into a long, steady consolidation: purge and punish first, then institutionalize control, and finally win consent through benefits and symbolism. The strategy was effective, ruthless, and pragmatic. A little grim, yes, think of it as ruthless statecraft with a social media PR campaign attached. Philippi, defeating the liberators. Near the city of Philippi in Macedonia, two armies met in decisive combat as the men who had killed Julius Caesar faced those sworn to avenge him. The contest was not a single clash but two linked engagements fought on the same plane, and it decided who would control Rome's future. Commanders on both sides were seasoned politicians as well as soldiers, which made every move part military plan and part power play. Antony and Octavian led the triumviral forces, while Brutus and Cassius commanded the Republicans often called the Liberators. In the first engagement, the battlefield was effectively split. On one wing Antony overwhelmed Cassius's troops, while on the other Brutus pushed back Octavian's men. Cassius, seeing his camp lost and believing the day irretrievable, took his own life. Communication failures on a chaotic field cost him everything, a tragic reminder that bad news delivered too quickly can be as deadly as a sword. Think of it like a sports team collapsing because the coach heard halftime rumors and left the stadium. The rest is havoc. After that grim episode, the surviving liberator forces regrouped under Brutus, who still had the will to fight and some tactical success against Octavian. But the second engagement swung the balance. Antony's veterans, more experienced and heavier in numbers, coordinated well with Octavian's improving troops and pressed Brutus into retreat. Brutus, recognizing defeat and the ruin of his cause, chose death over capture. The coordinated pressure of infantry and cavalry, and the ability to exploit enemy confusion, made the difference. It's a bit like two well-drilled firefighters outmaneuvering a smaller volunteer crew. Training and coordination win the day. The immediate consequences were stark. The assassination plot's leaders were gone, their political network shattered, and the triumviral partners could carve the republic between them. For ordinary people and soldiers, that meant land confiscations, settlements for veterans, and a new political order emerging from the battlefield's smoke. Proscriptions, essentially public blacklists that allowed enemies to be killed and their property seized, had already been used earlier by the victors and continued to unsettle Roman society. In plain terms, it was state-sponsored exclusion and plunder, not unlike a modern forceful eviction combined with a financial blacklist. Beyond the battlefield, Philippi mattered because it cleared the way for one of the victors to reshape Rome in the long run. Octavian returned more firmly into a world without the liberators, and the alliance with Antony, though useful then, contained the seeds of later rivalry. Tactical choices, personal pride, and political ambition all mixed on that Macedonian plain. The story of Philippi shows how battlefield decisions ripple into politics. It's like an office merger where one meeting determines who gets the corner office, and who is shown the door. Rivalry and realignment with Mark Antony. Octavian and Mark Antony began as political partners, working together to clean up the chaos after Julius Caesar's death. They formally shared power with a third man, Lepidus, in what was called the Second Triumvirate, essentially three leaders dividing the map and the spoils, like three executives splitting control of a company after a hostile takeover. Antony took charge of the eastern provinces and grew increasingly tied to local interests and to the Egyptian queen Cleopatra, while Octavian remained the polished face of Rome at home, cultivating senators and the city's opinion. Power shifted gradually and then suddenly. Antony's public romance and political partnership with Cleopatra became a weapon in Octavian's hands. He framed Antony as a man who preferred foreign luxuries and loyalty to an Eastern queen over Roman tradition. Propaganda did the work of turning fence-sitters into enemies. To explain, propaganda is simply carefully arranged messaging meant to shape how people think, much like how a PR team today might leak a story or spin a scandal on social media. Octavian used Antony's correspondence and reported intentions as talking points. It was as if someone dug up a CEO's private emails and used them in a boardroom battle. Conflict moved from words to war. Octavian's forces blockaded and outmaneuvered Antony's fleets, cutting off supplies and forcing difficult decisions. Naval strategy mattered here. Control of the sea lanes limited the enemy's options and allowed a smaller, disciplined force to beat a larger, divided one. Think of it like a sports team that controls possession and tires out the opponent rather than trying risky plays. Antony and Cleopatra's retreat from that decisive engagement sealed the political realignment. Allies abandoned him, and his support withered. The consequences were dramatic and instructive for modern life. Octavian consolidated authority and reshaped Rome's political landscape into a system with a single dominant leader. He learned to turn a military victory into lasting political advantage. Antony's downfall shows how alliances can fracture when personal loyalties and public perception clash. In practical terms, it is a reminder that leaders today must manage relationships, public image, and strategy simultaneously. A business leader who ignores public perception or lets a partnership become a distraction risks the same kind of collapse, and a politician who loses control of the narrative can find allies slipping away, fast. A bit of old Roman drama, served with modern lessons and, yes, some ancient-style scandal, but the human patterns are surprisingly familiar. Egypt, Cleopatra, and the Eastern drama. When Octavian turned his full attention eastward, he met a political scene that looked more like theater than a battlefield, and Cleopatra was its leading actress. She was the Ptolemaic queen who ruled Egypt in the old Macedonian line, spoke several languages, and knew how to use religious imagery. Presenting herself as the living goddess Isis helped her win loyalty among Egyptians the way a popular celebrity uses branding today. Mark Antony's alliance and romantic tie with her gave the partnership both military muscle and dramatic flair, but it also handed Octavian a story he could tell to sway Rome, that Antony had been seduced not just by a woman, but by an entire Eastern way of life that threatened Roman manners and discipline. Octavian used that story cleverly. He publicized Antony's private decisions, including a will that seemed to bind him to Alexandria and to Cleopatra's children, and the revelation made many Romans uneasy in the same way a leaked text message can ruin a politician's image now. Cleopatra, for her part, staged royal spectacle with statues, temples, and rituals that linked her to familiar Egyptian gods, and Antony joined in, creating an image of a foreign court that seemed at odds with Roman ideals. The propaganda attack was practical as well as theatrical. By painting Antony as under foreign sway, Octavian opened the moral and political space to act without appearing merely power-hungry. Control of Egypt itself mattered for hard reasons beyond image. Egypt was a wealthy land with a massive grain supply and a treasurer capable of funding armies and building projects. Taking it meant securing bread for Rome and pay for soldiers. Octavian made sure Egypt would not fall into senatorial competition again, keeping it under an imperial official of equestrian rank and treating it almost as his private financial reserve. That move is like a CEO keeping the most profitable division under direct control, practical, unglamorous, and brutally effective. The aftermath mixed mercy and ruthlessness. Some of Cleopatra's and Antony's children were spared, brought to Rome, and raised under the supervision of Octavia, Antony's former Roman wife, while others who represented direct threats to the new regime did not survive. Cleopatra herself used every bit of royal theater available until the end. Her image and story then fed Roman triumphs and monuments, and her jewels and money literally helped pay for programs that reshaped the city. The whole episode shows how East and West clashed on political, cultural, and economic fronts, yet it also shows how skilled leadership can turn a dramatic foreign romance into domestic advantage. A little like modern spin, ancient propaganda could win a war without always having to win every heart. The road to Actium. Octavian moved with a mixture of patience and ruthless calculation, building alliances and eliminating rivals until only one major challenger remained. At first he shared power with two other strongmen, a formal arrangement that functioned like three roommates dividing a house, until arguments over money, status, and loyalties made the place unlivable. That arrangement allowed him to use state machinery legally while his opponents were distracted. He also used public trials, confiscations, and targeted killings to remove enemies, a grim form of housekeeping that left him cleaner than most but with plenty of stains on his conscience. Antony's partnership with Cleopatra became the political wedge Octavian needed. Antony was drawn east by wealth, military commands, and a personal alliance with the Egyptian queen, and that focus made him seem less tied to Roman traditions. When Antony publicly granted lands and honors to Cleopatra and her children, Romans saw it as if a leading citizen had handed over family heirlooms to a foreign in-law, a move that enraged many and made for easy talking points. Octavian turned these actions into a simple story: Antony was abandoning Rome for a foreign court. He spread letters, coins, and speeches to paint Antony as soft on Rome's interests, and in political terms this is propaganda, shaping what people believe by choosing which facts to show. Think of it like a social media campaign today, but with fewer memes and more senators. Meanwhile, the military chessboard was being set. Octavian consolidated command in the western provinces and concentrated naval power under a skilled admiral, Agrippa, who was good at blockades and surprise maneuvers. Antony still had significant land forces and a strong fleet tied to Cleopatra, but logistics started to bite him. Supply lines were cut, ports fell to Octavian's allies, and morale dipped. Naval warfare demands different skills than land battles. Big ships are powerful but clumsy, while smaller, well-handled vessels can outmaneuver them, like preferring a nimble speedboat over a floating apartment building when you need to zip between harbors. Octavian's naval strategy focused on choking off supplies and isolating Antony's forces, turning the fight into one where mobility and timing mattered more than sheer size. The decision to make a stand at sea was shaped by politics as much as by strategy. Antony felt pressure to fight to prove he still commanded loyalty, and Cleopatra's presence and fleet complicated his options. Her choices mattered because they affected both logistics and morale. Octavian capitalized on that uncertainty, keeping his messages simple and relentless, that he was defending Roman values while Antony had been seduced by foreign influence. Victory in the ensuing confrontation was not just a military win, it validated Octavian's narrative and gave him the political capital to reorganize power in Rome. In plain terms, he turned a complex rivalry into a clear story his supporters could believe, which is often how leaders win, not only by force, but by convincing people they were right. A little ruthlessness, a lot of timing, and some crafty messaging, and the path to supremacy was paved. Actium, the decisive naval battle. On the waters off western Greece, an important clash decided who would control Rome's future. Octavian's sea forces, under his trusted Admiral Agrippa, faced the allied fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra near a narrow coastal inlet by the Ionian shore. The two sides brought different strengths. One had tight organization and a plan to strangle supplies, the other relied on larger ships and the personal presence of a queen who sailed with the fleet. Think of it like a traffic jam at the mouth of a harbor, except the vehicles are wooden warships and the drivers keep trying to outmaneuver each other. Agrippa used blockades and careful positioning to cut off Antony's access to supplies and escape routes, turning logistics into a weapon. That's a simple idea. If you stop a rival from getting food and reinforcements, their strength melts away, the same way a catered office party dies quickly when the pizza stops arriving. Antony's challenge was harder because his fleet had to protect not just fighting ships but transport vessels and the people they carried, which made sharp maneuvers tricky. Cleopatra's smaller, swifter ships gave her mobility, but they also made her a tempting target and a wild card in the larger plan. The battle itself unfolded with tense, chaotic bursts. Skirmishes tested lines and probed for weak spots. Then came the turning point. Cleopatra's squadron slipped away, and Antony followed her, abandoning the bulk of his fleet in effect if not by intention. The sight of their leaders pulling back shattered confidence among many crews, and what had been a tense stalemate turned into a rout. It's a human story as much as a military one. When the people you look to for direction leave, others often do the same. A captain bolting from a sinking ship tends to send everyone else running for the lifeboats, even if he had a good reason. The immediate result was a collapse of Antony's naval power and a clear path for Octavian to press his advantage on land and at sea. The defeat at this port sealed the strategic picture. Control of the Mediterranean shifted with dramatic effects on politics and personal fates. One quick lesson from that day is how much modern strategy still depends on simple basics: supply lines, morale, and leadership presence. And for a touch of dry humor, history shows that no amount of royal glamour on a flagship can substitute for good logistics. Cleopatra may have had style, but she couldn't order replacement oars online. From general to statesman, return to Rome. He came back to the city careful to look like a private citizen, not a triumphant warlord. People who had seen him as a general were surprised to find a leader who preferred to accept modest titles and who spoke in the language of tradition. That was a political trick as much as a style choice. By keeping republican forms, senatorial debates, magistrates, public elections, he made deep changes feel less threatening. Think of it like a manager who keeps the old office furniture but quietly moves all the decision-making into a locked meeting room. He steadily shifted real power into hands that answered to him while the Senate retained visible authority. Instead of seizing roles outright, he controlled the key levers: the loyalty of the army, command over crucial provinces, and the right to propose laws. Simple example: if a company owner keeps the boardroom votes but also hires all the directors, the board still looks independent even though it follows the owner. He used this balanced approach to avoid the shock of radical reform while ensuring stability after years of fighting. He paid attention to everyday needs as well as grand politics. Veterans were given land or money to start new lives, which reduced unrest and created communities with a stake in the new order. City services were improved and public works renewed, roads, aqueducts, and temples were restored, making the city more livable and visually impressive. To the average Roman, these actions meant fewer disruptions and nicer public spaces, so the new regime felt practical, not just theoretical. He also cultivated an image through culture and law. Poets, artists, and architects were invited to celebrate the renewed peace, and laws were promoted to encourage family life and public morality. When people saw festivals, new buildings, and plays praising stability, they linked him with order and prosperity. For a modern comparison, it's like a political leader who sponsors national arts programs while also passing sensible safety rules. Everyone remembers the concerts and the common-sense fixes. At the same time, he reworked administration so decisions could be made efficiently. Provincial governance was reorganized so that strategically important regions were under direct imperial oversight while peaceful, established provinces stayed with the Senate. Judges and tax collectors were appointed with clearer lines of responsibility, reducing corruption and confusion. That helped merchants and ordinary citizens conduct business without constant uncertainty, which in turn reinforced acceptance of the new arrangements. He liked to be seen as both caring and in command. Public rituals, careful speeches, and modest public behavior made him appear like a guardian rather than a ruler. Yet behind that ritual was a professional bureaucracy and a reliable army ready to act if needed. It was a clever blend of stagecraft and administration, and it worked. People gained a sense of normal life returning, even as the foundations of power were quietly transformed. A little theater, a few good roads, and steady bookkeeping can do wonders for calming a whole city. The constitutional settlement and the Principate. After years of political violence and shifting alliances, Augustus put forward a political bargain that looks clever in retrospect: preserve the outward rituals and titles of the old republic while concentrating the real levers of power in one steady hand. He avoided the bluntness of a monarchy and instead called himself first citizen, or princeps, a label that sounded humble but masked strong authority. Think of it as a company where the founder keeps the boardroom ceremonies and the annual gala, but quietly controls hiring, budgeting, and strategy. Everyone applauds at the right moments, while the business actually runs on the founder's decisions. He combined two kinds of powers to make that control effective and hard to challenge. One was the power to command the armies, the legal and practical control of troops in the provinces, so that military force answered to him directly. The other was a civil power that gave him the right to propose laws, veto others, and act as the protector of the people's rights. This latter set of powers made local officials and magistrates defer to his judgment. Put simply, he held both the army's loyalty and the civic toolbox. Picture a city mayor who also happens to be the police chief. The meetings still look democratic, but enforcement follows the mayor's lead. He worked carefully to maintain a veneer of shared government. The Senate continued to meet, magistrates continued to be elected, and traditional ceremonies were kept alive, because symbols and routine matter to people. At the same time he reshaped institutions behind the scenes, deciding which provinces kept legions and appointing the men who governed those provinces, controlling key financial resources, and establishing a trusted household of advisors and administrators. It's like keeping your grandmother's china on display while installing a smart fridge and automated lights. The home looks the same, but the way it runs is very modern. A practical consequence was stability. Soldiers received more regular pay and rewards, provincial administration became more predictable, and public works could be coordinated across regions rather than left to chance. Ordinary citizens noticed roads, grain supplies, and a calmer city, small comforts that matter in daily life. At the same time, the system relied on consent, reputation, and subtle influence, legal authority mixed with informal prestige, which in everyday terms is like a popular team captain whose teammates follow him not only because of the rules, but because everyone respects his judgment. The setup encouraged a new kind of political career, men could aspire to senatorial honors and public office, but real advancement often depended on loyalty to the central leader and demonstrated competence. Patronage networks flourished, favors and appointments became the grease that kept wheels turning. Humor aside, it was efficient. Imagine a small company where most hires are made after a coffee and a handshake. The hiring manager's nod matters more than a formal job posting. Finally, the genius of this arrangement was its durability. By blending old forms with new powers, the system made opposition costly and success stable without the spectacle of open domination. People could point to familiar laws and institutions and say the republic lived on, while in practice decisions flowed from a single center. It's a lesson in politics and management: maintain traditions people care about, but modernize the engines that actually run things. Augustus, name, image, and imperial ideology. He was born Gaius Octavius and came to be known by several names over his life. One of those names, Augustus, was an official title that carried weight and a carefully crafted meaning: venerable, sacred, and above ordinary politics. That new name was not just a label, it was a brand with built-in authority, chosen and approved by the ruling body to signal a different kind of leadership. Changing a name like that is similar to a company rebranding itself to promise trust and stability. People expect more from a venerable brand than from a mere manager. Public images reinforced the message behind the name. Portraits and statues rarely showed him as an aging politician. Instead, he appears forever youthful and calm, a deliberate choice to suggest steadiness and timeless authority. The famous statue type that shows him in a military breastplate with a small cupid at his side hints at divine ancestry and military success at once. Coins acted like pocket-sized billboards. Everyone who used money saw his face and symbols that underlined peace, victory, or religious duty. Think of it as ancient PR, where statues, coins, and speeches were the broadcast commercials, plastering the same reassuring picture everywhere. Words and symbols mattered, but so did the story he promoted. He presented himself as someone who restored order and respected old customs, while actually concentrating power in new ways. He used the title princeps, meaning first citizen, to sound modest, and retained the term imperator when he wanted to highlight military command. Two Latin ideas are useful to know here: auctoritas, which means influence or moral authority rather than raw legal power, and pietas, the sense of dutiful respect toward gods, family, and the state. Explaining these in plain terms, auctoritas is like being the respected senior at work whose advice everyone follows, and pietas is the kind of dutiful behavior parents hope their kids show: loyal, responsible, and pious. To promote those values, he sponsored laws that encouraged family life and public religious rights, and he supported poets and artists to tell a unifying national story. Hiring Virgil and others to compose epic poetry was the cultural equivalent of commissioning a hit Anno Domini campaign to make people feel proud. Practical measures backed up the image and ideology. Public buildings, temples, and monuments were visible proof that his rule brought benefits: new forums, repaired temples, and festive ceremonies that reminded people of shared values. Propaganda was not subtle. Inscriptions and reliefs on monuments described peace and prosperity as direct results of his leadership. Patronage networks, giving favors, offices, and support to allies, created loyalty without formal declarations of monarchy. That's similar to a leader who quietly appoints supporters to key positions and funds community projects so everyone sees tangible results. It worked because ordinary people could walk past a newly paved road or a repaired temple and link the improvement to his name and image. The combination of a meaningful name, carefully controlled visual symbols, and an ideology presented as restoration created a durable template for rule. His image made abstract claims: sacred honor, military success, civic generosity, into everyday realities that people encountered in coins, speeches, and the urban landscape. And while the methods were ancient, the basic playbook feels familiar: manage your brand, tell a persuasive story, and deliver concrete benefits so the message sticks. A little theater, some architecture, a catchy poem, and a powerful brand name can go a long way. Administrative reforms and provincial rule. He reorganized the empire's territories so that Rome could actually run them without collapsing under its own size, dividing lands into imperial provinces, which he controlled directly, and senatorial provinces, which the Senate administered. Imperial provinces were the ones with armies, because the emperor kept the legions under his command to prevent rival generals from springing up like bad mushrooms. Senators still governed the peaceful provinces, places with little chance of revolt or barbarian trouble, so the Senate kept some practical work and some prestige, like a company board that signs the reports but doesn't visit the branches. To manage money and administration more cleanly, a separate imperial treasury was formed, called the fiscus, while the city's traditional treasury, the aerarium, continued to exist. Think of it as creating a corporate bank account for the emperor while the Senate kept the municipal piggy bank. Augustus also staffed many key posts with professional equestrians, men of the knight class who were reliable, trained, and less likely to use a provincial posting as a personal gold mine. These procurators handled finances, tax collection, and even the management of imperial lands, functioning much like modern regional accountants or estate managers who report back to headquarters. Local governance was encouraged rather than crushed. City councils and local elites were left to run day-to-day affairs, roads, markets, local courts, so long as they kept order and paid their dues. This was practical. Rome relied on local people who knew the language and customs, just as a company uses local managers in foreign branches. When governors did wrong, provincials could appeal to the emperor. The appeal process and occasional investigations reduced blatant extortion, and the knowledge that Rome watched made many governors think twice before turning a province into their personal ATM. Communication and logistics received attention too. A state-run courier system, the cursus publicus, moved messages and officials across the empire, and there were organized supply chains for the army and major urban centers. It's like having a dependable postal and freight service so that orders, tax records, and grain could travel without getting lost or eaten by bandits. Augustus also created a standing force of imperial guards for Italy and Rome, a professional unit that protected the emperor and helped keep governors from becoming private warlords, bodyguards with salaries, not men paid in promises. Legal and administrative consistency was emphasized, not chaotic reinvention. Laws and administrative procedures were standardized where needed, and special imperial agents could be dispatched to audit accounts or settle disputes. Simple, everyday examples help. A provincial tax farmer under the old system might have treated taxation like every man for himself. Under Augustus a procurator kept books, audits were possible, and local councils had clearer responsibilities. The result was a calmer, more predictable rule in the provinces that allowed trade and civic life to continue, which in turn filled the coffers and reduced the number of angry letters to Rome, though a few still made it, and emperors have always had critics. Military reorganization and veteran settlements. When Augustus rebuilt the army he turned what had been a temporary citizen force into a professional, permanent one, and that changed everything. Men signed up for a fixed career, about 20 years for a legionary, and received regular pay instead of fighting only when called by their city. The result was discipline and predictability. Soldiers trained year after year, learned standard tactics, and were stationed along the frontiers rather than marching home after each campaign. He also created a permanent imperial guard in Rome to protect the ruler directly, a force that lived and trained near the capital and answered to the emperor rather than to local senators. A special military treasury was set up to make sure veterans would be taken care of at the end of service. That fund was supported by a small inheritance tax, a reliable, easy-to-explain source of money, and it paid pensions or financed land grants. Instead of being left to fend for themselves, former soldiers were given plots of land or cash to start civilian lives. Picture a soldier hanging up his helmet and getting a modest farm on a provincial estate, or buying a small shop in a growing town. In practical terms it was like a modern retirement package combined with a relocation bonus. Settling veterans had several down-to-earth effects. First, veterans brought skills. They knew engineering, road building, and basic organization, so their colonies often became hubs of trade and order. Second, these settlements spread Roman language and law. When a veteran ran the local court or taught his neighbors Latin phrases, Roman habits took root. Third, local security improved because experienced ex-soldiers formed a reliable backup militia for the area. Think of it as placing well-trained retirees around the countryside to keep the peace, except they could still march if needed. And yes, many preferred plowshares to spearheads. A retired centurion who could fix a roof or lead a town meeting was priceless. The military reorganization also reshaped loyalties in a very practical way. Since the state controlled pay, promotions, and retirement benefits, troops had a clear interest in supporting the emperor who managed those rewards. That reduced the chance that a charismatic general could simply march on Rome and expect mass support. At the same time, veteran colonies knitted the provinces closer to Rome, local economies grew, roads and markets expanded, and former soldiers often became civic leaders. A veteran running a bakery or overseeing the communal granary might sound humble, but such roles created stability, and stability was Augustus's main business. A little humor helps. After a life of marches and mud, many veterans probably thought trading a legionary gate for a farmer's shuffle was a fair deal. Fiscal policy, trade, and economic stability. Augustus reorganized Rome's finances by separating the money that paid for public needs from the emperor's personal funds, and that change had big practical effects. He kept a public chest for the Senate and people of Rome while creating an imperial treasury to cover the costs of running the empire, paying soldiers, and managing far-flung provinces. That move reduced confusion about who paid for what and made it harder for money to disappear into the wrong pockets, a welcome change, because tax collectors were already as popular as rainy market days. He professionalized tax collection so the state stopped relying so much on private middlemen who bought the right to collect taxes and then squeezed every coin they could. Instead, salaried agents and imperial accountants were put in place to handle revenue in imperial provinces, which made income more stable and predictable. Think of it like switching from handing your shop's receipts to a sketchy neighbor to hiring an honest bookkeeper. It costs a little more upfront, but your accounts stop looking like a mystery novel. A new military pay and pension fund was set up and funded through a modest inheritance tax. This provided a steady way to reward veterans without repeatedly raiding the general treasury, and veterans moving to farm or settle land also helped production and local markets. At the same time, Augustus worked on stabilizing the coinage and backing public confidence in money, because coins people trust make trade faster and cheaper. When merchants know what a coin is worth, they don't need to weigh each piece at every market stall. That speeds up business and lowers the cost of doing deals. Trade benefited from safer roads and sea lanes, and from clearer rules at ports and frontier markets. Better security on the routes reduced losses to bandits and pirates, which lowered the cost of transport and insurance. Yes, even back then someone had to worry about shipment safety. Grain, olive oil, wine, and metals moved more reliably across the Mediterranean, and commerce reaching as far as the Red Sea routes helped bring exotic goods into Roman markets. A good analogy, improving roads and ports is like upgrading from pothole-filled backstreets to a modern highway and freight terminal. Prices fall, delivery is faster, and everyone sells more. On the domestic front, public building projects and investments in infrastructure put people to work and kept money circulating in towns and cities. By balancing spending, building reserves, and avoiding large, sudden tax grabs, the administration promoted economic stability and merchant confidence. In ordinary life this felt like having a steady paycheck instead of living paycheck to paycheck. When people can plan, they invest in tools, homes, and businesses, which in turn keeps the economy humming. And yes, even then, keeping the books balanced was sometimes less dramatic than a triumph parade, but far more useful when it came to feeding the city and keeping markets functioning. Moral laws and social engineering. Augustus pushed a set of laws that reached deep into people's homes, not just the Senate house. He wanted to bring back older Roman habits, the mos maiorum, or customs of the ancestors, by reshaping family behavior through clear rules. The package included measures that encouraged marriage, punished adultery, and tried to steer the upper classes toward having more children and marrying within approved social lines. He also mixed legal penalties with public rituals and cultural nudges, so the law did not stand alone but worked alongside religion, literature, and public honors. One striking feature was a system of rewards and penalties that made marriage and parenthood financially and legally attractive. Men and women who produced enough children could gain special privileges, and those who stayed single or childless could see limits placed on their inheritance rights. Think of it as an early version of tax breaks for families or priority access to certain honors. The state literally rewired incentives to change private choices. At the same time, adultery became a punishable offense, not just a private shame. Guilty parties could face exile or loss of status. Augustus even enforced these rules within his own family, which sent a very public message. Beyond courts and fines, cultural tools were deployed. Poets were encouraged to praise domestic virtues, temples and ceremonies were revived to bless family life, and sumptuary expectations nudged people toward simpler, more respectable behavior. The elite saw rules about who could marry whom, because mixing social classes could weaken the hierarchy Augustus wanted to preserve. This mix of legal pressure and cultural messaging is a textbook case of social engineering. Change the incentives, change the story people tell about themselves, and behavior starts to follow. Imagine a government-sponsored campaign that hands out medals, sermons, and stern newspaper columns all at once. That was his strategy, minus the social media. Not everything worked as planned, of course. People found workarounds, like manipulating wills, arranging marriages of convenience, or using adoption and guardianship rules to keep wealth and status intact while avoiding the spirit of the law. Some of the upper classes complied visibly while quietly bending the rules. Still, the combination of carrots and sticks shifted norms. Marriage and childbearing became politically and morally charged acts rather than purely private ones. Contemporary readers can picture the same dynamic at play today when states use benefits, penalties, and public praise to steer family life, just with fewer togas and more forms to fill out. Religious revival and the imperial cult. After years of political chaos, he pushed hard to put religion back at the center of public life, not as nostalgia but as a tool to knit society together. He repaired and rebuilt temples, sponsored visible monuments like the Arapaces and a temple to Mars, and restored the calendar of festivals so people had reasons to gather and celebrate together. The goal was simple: get the gods on Rome's side again, which the Romans called ensuring the peace of the gods, basically making sure the divine neighborhood watch was satisfied. For ordinary citizens that meant more public sacrifices, processions, and ceremonies where priests took the lead in families' renewed religious duties, much like community festivals today that bring neighbors out into the streets. He also made religion part of the political structure by taking control of its key offices, becoming the chief priest himself, which gave him formal authority over religious practice. Pontifex Maximus, the title, simply meant head of the priests, and it let him shape which rituals mattered, who ran them, and how festivals looked. This was practical. Centralized oversight meant a consistent public message, and people noticed when their leaders showed up at rites. Think of it like a CEO who also hosts the company picnic. It's a show of care and control at once. A big piece of the strategy was the imperial cult, a system where cities and provinces honored the ruler's spirit or his image in public worship, often paired with the worship of Rome itself. In the eastern parts of the empire, where honoring living rulers had long been a local custom, cities already had ways to treat leaders like quasi-divine figures, so this fit easily. Western communities were handled more cautiously. Rather than demanding outright worship in Rome, he encouraged festivals and altars to the ruler's genius, the protective spirit associated with a person, and promoted the cult of his predecessor who had been declared divine. Coins, statues, and public ceremonies carried his likeness and messages. Coins were the ancient equivalent of a billboard or a social media post. That helped tie loyalty to him into people's everyday routines of paying taxes, attending games, and joining public sacrifices. The combination of legal, architectural, and ritual change made religion both comforting and political, strengthening community bonds while legitimizing his authority. Ordinary people experienced this as more frequent festivals, restored temples they could visit, and priests appointed by the central power who organized public life. Soldiers and local officials took part too. receiving religious blessings before campaigns or civic events, which turned private belief into public practice. The result was a subtle but deep reshaping of how Romans connected religion, family life, and loyalty to the state, and if you squint a little, it looks a lot like modern leaders using national holidays, monuments, and ceremonies to create a shared identity. Cultural patronage: Virgil, Horace, and the arts. Augustus used poets and artists as part of his public strategy, supporting them so their work reinforced shared values and gave people stories to rally around. His close associate Maecenas organized a circle of writers and painters who received financial support and social access. Poets like Virgil and Horace were among the most prominent names to emerge from that circle. This was not charity for charity's sake. The state helped pay the bills, and in return the arts helped craft a sense of unity and purpose that ordinary citizens could understand. Think of it as an early public relations campaign, only with more laurel wreaths and fewer press releases. Virgil produced long, polished poems that tied local legends into a grand national story, offering readers a clear idea of where they came from and why their city mattered. His earlier pastoral and farming poems showed an eye for everyday life, and his later epic focused on origins, duty, and destiny. Those themes were easy for people to latch onto. Scholars point to the Aeneid as providing a heroic ancestry that connected Rome's past to a shared future. In modern terms, it was like a blockbuster film that helped people feel part of the same story. Poetic flourishes and dramatic scenes made abstract ideas, like duty, family, and public service, feel vivid, the way a well-made movie scene can turn a slogan into a shiver down the spine. Horace wrote in a different register, shorter, sharper, and often personally humorous. His odes and letters mixed praise for the present regime with gentle reminders to live sensibly, enjoy life, work hard, and keep your feet on the ground. He could flatter a patron one moment and skewer a pompous social climber the next, much as a modern columnist might praise a city mayor while teasing a vanity project. The phrase, carpe diem, which people still quote today, captures the tasteful balance Horace struck: make the most of today, but don't be reckless about it. His voice made the new order feel human and relatable, rather than merely imposing a list of rules. Beyond poetry, Augustus' cultural program extended into visual arts and public monuments that made ideas visible in the urban landscape. Sculptures, reliefs, and temples presented scenes of peace, order, and piety that the population walked past every day. The Era Pacis, for example, celebrates a message of peace and prosperity in stone. Commissioning public art was a practical move. Murals and statues are like billboards for values, easy to read even if you can't parse a long speech. Everyday examples help. A city that funds a new museum or a festival sends a clear message about what it values, just as Augustus' building projects did. And yes, there was a political edge. Patronage could lift careers, but it could also set boundaries, as shown by other poets who fell out of favor for stepping too far. The lasting effect was that poems and monuments from that time became shared reference points, stories and images people returned to when debating what their community stood for. Modern governments and philanthropists still use the same tools. They fund films, concerts, and public art to shape identity and memory. The ancient model combined money, social connections, and a good eye for narrative. When it worked, the results were beautiful, persuasive, and surprisingly human, complete with a few jealous rivals and occasional poetic drama. Building Rome, architecture and public works. Augustus set a very public stamp on the city by turning everyday needs into grand statements about order and pride. He sponsored new temples and public buildings, and pushed for repairs and fresh construction across Rome so that temples, forums, baths, and markets would serve both practical needs and political image. The result was a city where utility and beauty walked hand in hand. Water reached fountains and houses through long stone channels, open squares hosted markets and speeches, and temples rose with decorated facades that invited citizens to look up and feel part of something larger. Some of the best-known projects linked to his rule include a new forum built as a setting for law and display, a monumental altar celebrating peace, and the rebuilding of an earlier temple that later generations would call the Pantheon. Marcus Agrippa, his close colleague, handled much of the engineering and construction work, Agrippa brought technical know-how and the kind of managerial skill that today you'd expect from a project manager juggling contractors and deliveries. Baths were opened in public spaces so people could bathe, exercise, and gossip. Think of them as a cross between a community pool, a gym, and your neighborhood cafe. The heating systems under the floors kept things cozy. Romans had ways to warm a room that might remind you of warmed floors or sit on radiators. Infrastructure improvements were no less important than monuments. Aqueducts were extended and maintained so fresh water could flow to public fountains, private houses, and public baths. That water supply is roughly the ancient equivalent of modern water mains. Roads were kept usable and connected to the urban core, allowing goods and people to move more easily across the city. Even the city's sewage and drainage systems received attention to reduce floods and nasty smells. Sanitation might not be glamorous, but it keeps a city civilized, or at least less smelly. Funding came from the state treasury and from spoils and taxes, and projects were chosen partly for usefulness and partly for their capacity to impress. Materials and style mattered a lot. Where earlier Rome often used brick or plain stone, projects in this era favored facing buildings with marble and decorating facades with columns and relief sculpture. That marble veneer was like giving a modest house a shiny new coat of siding, instant prestige. Artists and craftsmen were employed to carve reliefs that told stories of victories, gods, and civic virtues. Those carvings served as visual messaging in a time when not everyone read. The use of arches, vaults, and concrete allowed larger covered spaces, practical for markets and public halls, and gave architects new freedom to design ambitious interiors. Today you can still see the echoes of that program in how modern cities prioritize visible public works, good water supply, clean streets, attractive public squares, and well-maintained cultural buildings. The idea that public architecture should both work well and look dignified remains useful. And if you ever grumble about local construction, remember that ancient Rome needed a whole league of builders, planners, and organizers to make fountains flow and baths stay warm. It took teamwork then, too. A little bureaucracy, a lot of vision, and some good masonry went a long way, and sometimes a bit of marble can cheer up even a tired street. Law, bureaucracy, and civic administration. Augustus reorganized how the state actually ran its day-to-day business, moving power from informal patronage toward a more predictable system. He kept old-sounding institutions but staffed many of them with trained people who were paid to do specific jobs, which made administration steadier and less dependent on who happened to be persuasive that week. Think of it like a household where the owner stopped asking the neighbor's kid to fetch the bills and instead hired a reliable bookkeeper who showed up every morning. The bills get paid on time and fewer lamps go out. He created a clearer chain of command for provincial and city administration, placing professional officials in charge of tax collection, public works, and legal cases. These officials were often chosen from the equestrian order rather than the political elite, so their job was an occupation rather than a stepping stone to fame. A modern analogy would be hiring a career civil servant to run the postal service instead of letting a rotating group of politicians take turns. That brought continuity, roads stayed repaired, grain shipments were more reliable, and municipal leaders had a framework to work within instead of improvising every crisis. Legal processes also became more centralized and consistent, with imperial agents presiding over many disputes and enforcing law across regions. Ordinary citizens benefited because judges and administrators followed clearer rules, even if those rules were sometimes used to strengthen the central ruler's control. As an example from everyday life, a merchant who once had to plead his case to a different local council in every town could increasingly expect a uniform standard of justice as he moved between cities. The system still had favoritism, humans are humans, but the professionalization reduced outright chaos. Public safety and urban services were made practical concerns rather than afterthoughts. Special units handled firefighting and night patrols in the capital, and officials supervised the grain supply so the poor wouldn't suddenly wake up to empty breadbaskets. That's similar to how modern cities have fire departments and food safety inspectors. Sensible planning prevents a lot of misery. Administration also extended to record-keeping and official communications. Couriers and offices were set up to transport orders and paperwork, so local magistrates could receive instructions and remit reports without weeks of delay. Finally, the emperor relied on trusted freedmen and career administrators for confidential and technical tasks, agents who managed finances, supervised public works and kept detailed records, while preserving the appearance of traditional republican offices. This dual approach was clever. It satisfied the public demand for traditional institutions while giving real power to a stable, professional bureaucracy. The result was an administrative machine that ran the city and its provinces with more predictability. It wasn't perfect, but when the aqueducts broke or taxes needed recalculating, someone who knew their job was there to fix it. Foreign policy, diplomacy, and client kings. Augustus treated Rome's neighbors as pieces on a chessboard, but he preferred to move them with a gentle hand rather than smash them with a hammer every time. His foreign policy mixed clear-eyed realism with careful showmanship. When outright conquest was too costly or risky, he set up arrangements that kept Rome safe and influential without filling the city with fresh veterans. This meant building buffers, keeping friendly rulers in place, and using diplomacy to settle big problems, like getting back Roman military standards from Parthia, rather than starting another expensive war. Client kings were the backbone of this approach. A client king was a local ruler who kept his throne by cooperating with Rome, paying attention to Rome's interests, and often accepting Roman money, troops, or advice. Think of it as a franchise arrangement. Rome supplied protection and prestige, and the client supplied loyalty and local control. Herod the Great in Judea is a clear example. He ruled his own territory and carried out major building projects, yet he relied on Roman backing to stay in power and to keep peace among fractious local groups. Juba II in Mauritania is another vivid case. Raised and educated in Rome, he blended Roman tastes with local rule, acting almost like a Roman emissary who happened to wear a crown. Diplomacy under Augustus was not just formal speeches and letters. It was elaborate theater. Envoys were exchanged, gifts given, marriages arranged or encouraged, and public ceremonies staged to show Rome's superiority without destroying local dignity. When Parthia returned Roman standards, it was a diplomatic victory that cost far less blood than another trench of warfare would have. Augustus used such moments to show that Rome could get what it wanted by pressure paired with negotiation. He also provided subsidies and military support to friendly kings so that Rome could rely on them as a first line of defense. Those client rulers were expected to manage local disputes, raise troops when needed, and act as buffers against hostile powers farther away. In everyday terms, Augustus's strategy resembled a neighborhood with a trustworthy sheriff and cooperative block captains. Instead of personally policing every street, the sheriff empowered local leaders, paid them a little, and made sure they reported problems. That saved time and resources. Some client kings, like Amintas in parts of Anatolia, proved useful because they knew the terrain, spoke local languages, and could move faster than Roman legions. But this system required constant attention. A careless subsidy or a slight insult could flip loyalty overnight, so Augustus kept a mix of rewards and reminders, occasional troop movements, statues, public honors, to keep the relationship healthy. This blend of diplomacy and client rule also shaped Rome's image abroad. Rather than rule every province directly, Rome could appear magnanimous, allowing locals to preserve customs while aligning them with Roman interests. It made Rome seem like a partner rather than a conqueror in many places. Yet that partnership had teeth. Client kings were ultimately dependent on Roman approval and could be deposed if they failed. The balance was delicate. Augustus had to be persuasive and shrewd, like a manager who praises hard-working employees but is ready to replace the slackers. The overall result was a more stable frontier and a quieter empire, which, for Rome, meant more time and money for roads, trade, and showy public works. Frontiers, legions, and border strategy. Augustus reorganized the Roman army into a permanent, professional force under the emperor's control. He turned what had often been an Anno Domini hoc collection of troops raised for a campaign into standing legions that trained, lived, and worked year after year. Think of it like transforming a seasonal volunteer fire brigade into a full-time, well-equipped emergency service that knows the town inside out. The Praetorian Guard served as an inner circle of bodyguards and political enforcers in the capital, a kind of elite security detail whose presence changed the balance of power back home. Rivers and natural features became the easiest anchors for borders, so they were used as clear lines of defense. The Rhine and the Danube, for example, were not just pretty scenery, they functioned as highways, barriers, and supply lines all at once. Forts and watchtowers were built along these lines, linked by roads so troops could move quickly. Picture a string of Coast Guard stations or border checkpoints connected by good roads so reinforcements and supplies arrive fast. No one wants a slow-moving supply train when trouble shows up. Diplomacy and alliances were as important as walls and soldiers. Client kings and local allies were used as buffers, meaning Rome preferred friendly rulers on its fringes rather than full occupation everywhere. These local rulers handled much of the day-to-day control, paying taxes and keeping the peace, while the Roman legions provided the heavy backup when needed. Veterans were settled in colonies near frontiers. Those communities served a double purpose by rewarding soldiers and spreading Roman ways of life, language, law, and trade, to places that might otherwise remain hostile. It's a bit like offering pensions to retired officers who then open small businesses and become respected pillars of a community. Logistics and communication mattered enormously and were treated practically. Roads, bridges, and river patrols kept supplies moving and let commanders respond quickly to threats. Local intelligence networks, informants, scouts, and allied leaders, gave commanders advance warning of trouble, much like neighborhood watch tips before the police arrive. Command was centralized under officers loyal to the emperor, which reduced the chance of independent generals acting on their own whims. The result was a blend of hard defenses, mobile forces, and political maneuvering that kept the frontiers secure enough for trade and local life to carry on, with the occasional stubborn skirmish reminding everyone that borders are never entirely decorative. Family, marriage, and succession planning. Born into a respectable senatorial family with a notable connection to a famous general, Augustus immediately saw family ties as political tools as well as personal ones. His mother was closely related to Julius Caesar, and that connection would shape everything from his name to his future responsibilities. He used marriages and legal adoptions the way a modern executive might use partnerships and succession planning, to lock allies in place and to create clear lines of inheritance. Adoption in Rome was not just sentimental, it made someone legally part of your family, gave them your name, and put them in line to inherit both property and political clout. Think of it as signing someone into your company with full shares and a title. Marriages were arranged with the same practical eye. He married Scribonia and had one daughter, Julia, with her. The marriage ended the day Julia was born. That abrupt split was less about romance and more about politics. Later he married Livia, who came with her own children from a previous marriage, most importantly Tiberius. Livia's presence introduced a new dynamic, a stepfamily that would become central to the question of who should rule next. He also orchestrated his daughter Julia's marriages to cement alliances. She was wed to members of the elite who could supply loyal supporters and potential heirs. Those unions produced children who were raised and positioned to carry on the family mantle. Succession planning was pragmatic, sometimes ruthless, and always public. Instead of relying on bloodline alone, he elevated promising men through honors, offices, and military commands so that people would come to expect and respect them as future leaders. He adopted his grandsons by Julia, giving them his name and status, and prepared them with visible roles that taught them governance and command, much like giving a chosen successor high-profile projects before handing over the CEO's chair. When those heirs died young, he reassessed and turned to Tiberius, bringing him into the center of state business and formal ceremonies so the public and the political class would accept him. Personal behavior and family law were also tools of governance. He pushed laws that encouraged marriage and punished adultery, projecting the image that a stable family life served the state. He enforced those rules even when they touched his own household. His daughter Julia was publicly punished for scandalous behavior and sent into exile, a dramatic example of how private family matters were used to signal public standards. In ordinary life, This is like a company CEO enforcing a strict code of conduct on top executives to prove the rules apply to everyone, including the boss's family. Behind the scenes, networks of kinship, patronage, and legal maneuvering operated constantly. Marriages were negotiated, adoptions formalized, and young men were sent to command armies or hold magistracies to build reputations. Livia's influence in promoting her son shows how a persuasive family member can shift plans. In modern terms, it's similar to a powerful board member quietly steering a succession vote. Augustus combined warm family loyalty with cold strategic calculation. Sometimes affection and statecraft were indistinguishable, and sometimes they pulled in different directions. The outcome was a durable, if imperfect, system that handed power to those who had been trained, tested, and legally accepted as successors, a family dynasty run with the precision of a well-planned estate transfer, but with the occasional domestic scandal that reminds you people are people, even when they wear togas. Propaganda, coins, monuments, and literature. Augustus shaped how people saw him by using objects and words that everyone met in daily life, small coins in pockets, huge public buildings in the city, and poems read aloud at dinner parties. Coins were the most widespread tool because they traveled with ordinary Romans, soldiers, merchants, market-goers, and could carry a clear picture and message on each side. He favored clearly recognizable portraits on gold and silver coins, the aureus and denarius, often showing an idealized, youthful face wearing a laurel wreath, or symbols like spears and sacrificial bowls to suggest military strength and religious duty. Some coins carried images of his grandsons as young heirs, which is a lot like a modern politician plastering family photos on campaign flyers to say, stability and succession here. He also used the phrase, son of the divine, on some issues to remind people of his sacred connection to his predecessor, a gentle way to mix religion and authority without sounding like a TV advertisement. Monuments did the heavy lifting of public theater. They were big, permanent statements placed where people walked every day. The Era Paces, an altar richly carved with scenes of procession and family, presented peace as a gift that came through the ruler's actions, not just a promise. The Temple of Mars altar in his forum gave a sense of divine backing and a place for important legal and military ceremonies. Even the mausoleum served as propaganda. It was a visible symbol that tied his family into the city's landscape and future. Think of these buildings as giant billboards and community centers rolled into one. They celebrated public rituals, hosted official events, and reminded citizens, loudly and visually, who had made the city beautiful and orderly again. The carvings and placement were carefully chosen to stress family, piety, and service, and to make the message feel like part of daily Roman life rather than a lecture. Writing and literature rounded out the message in a subtler style, working through stories and praise instead of simply showing a face. Augustus supported and cultivated poets and writers who could shape Roman ideas about duty, ancestry, and moral behavior. Virgil's epic linked Rome's origins to heroic ancestors and framed the new order as the fulfillment of a long destiny, while Horace's odes praised moderation, public duty, and the ruler's virtues, short poems that moved easily from elite salons to official occasions. At the same time, the Residential Gesti, a public list of accomplishments written by Augustus himself and inscribed on stone, acted like an official resume carved in marble and placed where visitors and subjects could read it. Copies were set up in various parts of the empire, so the story traveled beyond Rome. Not all writers got a free pass. Ovid, a popular poet with a more personal and playful voice, was exiled, which showed that literary support had limits and that the regime could be sensitive about what went too far. Together these methods formed a simple but powerful strategy. The image on a coin, the relief on a monument, and the lines of a poem all reinforced the same ideas about stability, family, and sacred duty. People encountered these messages at different tempos, instantly in a purse, daily on a street corner, slowly through reading or recitation, and that repetition made the story feel natural. It's like modern branding, small ads, flagship stores, and sponsored media all working to make an identity stick. Augustus's combination of money, monuments, and literature managed to turn political promotion into civic culture, and he did it with enough subtlety that many Romans came to accept the new order as simply the right and proper way for Rome to be. personality, private life, and scandals. Augustus cultivated an image of modesty, religion, and order while holding nearly unlimited power behind the scenes. Born Gaius Octavius and later taking the name Augustus, he carefully shaped public perception by promoting traditional Roman virtues, piety, sobriety, and devotion to family, yet he combined that with a sharp political mind that preferred long games to flash-in-the-pan moves. He liked symbols, a plain toga for public appearances, temples and monuments to signal revival, and coins with his portrait to remind people who was in charge. Think of it like a CEO who wears a simple sweater to meetings but controls the board and the press. The appearance matters because it sells stability. In private life he was surprisingly disciplined and, by Roman standards, restrained. He had 2 significant marriages, one brief, politically motivated union with Scribonia that ended the moment his daughter was born, and a long, unusually close partnership with Livia Drusilla, who stayed by his side and influenced court life. Family ties were also instruments of power. He arranged marriages, adopted heirs, and kept relatives under tight scrutiny. His relationship with his only biological child, Julia, was complex. He loved her but also punished her when she broke the very moral rules he promoted. Family dinners must have been awkward at times. Scandals and rumors clustered around his household and his circle. Julia's exile for adultery became the most public blot on Augustus's moral legislation, showing a sharp contradiction. He passed laws to encourage marriage and punish sexual immorality, then condemned his own daughter for violating them. Ancient writers like Suetonius and Tacitus hinted that Livia might have helped eliminate rivals to secure the succession, including whispers about poison. Modern historians treat those claims with caution, and there is no conclusive proof. Still, the persistence of such stories tells you something about how power breeds suspicion. It's like a workplace rumor mill. People fill unknown gaps with scandal when decisions are secretive. His personality blended caution, patience, and a taste for control. He rarely showed rash anger in public but could be ruthless in removing obstacles, whether by exile, forced retirement, or political sidelining. At the same time he loved culture and the arts and used patronage to win loyalty. Poets wrote him flattering verses, and public works bore his stamp. That mix of soft power and hard measures created both admiration and resentment. Friends praised his cleverness, opponents resented the limits on their freedom. In short, Augustus was a master at stage managing both his image and his family, with all the contradictions that come when a ruler tries to be a moral exemplar while running an empire. Death, funeral, and deification. In his final days at a quiet villa in Nola he fell ill and passed away, leaving a hush over Rome that few leaders ever inspire. He had arranged his succession and made clear who should follow him, so the political transition was orderly rather than chaotic, a practical move, like leaving clear instructions for a complicated family business. Rumors immediately swirled. Some ancient writers hinted at foul play, and others blamed natural causes. Those whispers are part of the story, but surviving records show that his death was treated as a major public event and not just a private family loss. The state took charge of the funeral rites almost at once. His body was brought back to the capital, displayed for the people, and carried in a grand procession that echoed old Roman traditions, ancestral masks, ceremonial music, and citizens lining the route to pay their respects. The ceremony mixed personal grief with public pageantry. Think of a national memorial service that also includes a parade and ancestral pictures, all meant to communicate both loss and continuity. Friends and officials spoke, and the show of loyalty from the elites helped signal that the government would continue to function. After the cremation, his ashes were placed in the great mausoleum he had prepared for himself, a permanent marker in the city landscape that people could visit and point to for generations. The Senate granted him divine honors, declaring him a god in the official sense used by the Romans. This was more than an honorific title. It meant that temples could be dedicated, priests appointed, and sacrifices made in his name. To put it simply, the state turned remembrance into worship, much like how modern societies might canonize a cultural hero by naming holidays, erecting statues, or dedicating public buildings. That official deification had wide practical effects. Provinces throughout the empire established cults honoring him, coins, images, and ceremonies kept his memory central to civic life. For ordinary people, this translated into festivals and rituals they attended, which reinforced loyalty to the new regime. Livia, his widow, played a key role in stabilizing the succession and promoting his divine status, smoothing the path for the new ruler to step in. Some contemporaries accepted the deification as a fitting tribute. Others treated it skeptically. Still, the blend of funeral ritual and subsequent worship set a powerful precedent. Rulers could be memorialized in ways that combined politics, religion, and public spectacle, an effective recipe for keeping a leader's influence alive after death, and occasionally, a source of gossip at family dinners centuries later. Immediate legacy: Tiberius and the Julio-Claudians. Augustus left a clear but delicate framework of rule that his chosen successor, Tiberius, had to operate within. He inherited the imperial office rather than inventing it, and so his first task was to show that power could continue smoothly when a single strong figure held it. That continuity reassured the army and the administration, while also revealing a problem. Concentrating authority in one person makes the question of succession a constant, tense issue, like a family business waiting for the founder to hand over the keys. Tiberius governed in a cautious and often stubborn way. He was competent with troops and administration, preferring steady management over flashy public displays. People today might compare him to a sober CEO who tightens the budget, insists on discipline, and quietly reshuffles middle managers. He kept the treasury healthy and pursued law and order, but he also allowed a climate where accusations of treason could be used as weapons. In everyday terms, that's similar to an office where any critical comment might trigger a formal HR investigation. Staff get quieter and gossip grows. A major and dramatic issue during his time was the rise and fall of a powerful deputy, Sejanus, who ran the Praetorian Guard and briefly held huge sway. Power handed to a single lieutenant can shift the balance of an organization very fast. Sejanus' ambition and subsequent removal showed how dangerous it is to let the leader's closest aides accumulate unchecked influence. Think of a bodyguard who starts making hiring decisions for the CEO, and then suddenly people wonder who's actually in charge. The fallout left people suspicious and made governance more secretive. The longer-term result was mixed. On one hand, Tiberius helped normalize the imperial system, a centralized ruler backed by institutions, a professional army, a standing guard, and a bureaucracy that could carry out policy. On the other hand, his methods, secrecy, show trials, and reliance on close inner circles, set patterns that later members of the Julio-Claudian line both copied and complicated. Later rulers would alternate between capable administration and notorious excess, and the question of how to pass power without chaos remained a stubborn problem. Modern readers can take a simple lesson from all this: stable institutions and clear rules for succession matter more than personality, and leaving key decisions to a tight inner circle is rarely wise. After all, letting your security team pick the next boss might make for a good spy movie, but it's a terrible business plan. Long-term impact: Rome transformed. Augustus reorganized Rome's political life so that real power rested with a single leader, while old republican forms, senators, magistrates, elections, kept functioning in public view. This created a durable system often called the Principate, which combined visible tradition with behind-the-scenes control. Think of it like a company that keeps its founding board but hands the CEO final say. By concentrating military command and many administrative tasks in the hands of the emperor, government decisions moved faster and became more consistent across the wide territories Rome controlled. Consistency matters. When rules, taxes, and legal processes don't keep changing, farmers, merchants, and builders can plan ahead without constantly looking over their shoulders. The administrative changes lasted because they built institutions, not just personalities. A professional staff handled taxation, public works, and record-keeping, creating an early civil service that could outlive any single ruler. That meant roads were repaired on a schedule, grain was distributed in times of need, and local disputes could be escalated to a central authority when necessary. If you've lived in a city with a reliable utilities department, you know why that matters. reliable public services make daily life predictable and commerce possible. Augustus also streamlined provincial governance, so local elites could keep running their towns under guidance rather than chaotic direct rule, which smoothed relations and reduced rebellions. A long peace across much of the Mediterranean followed, and stability enabled economic growth and cultural exchange. Trade routes remained open, artisans and merchants found new markets, and cities grew because people could move and do business without constant fear of conflict. Infrastructure projects, roads, bridges, aqueducts, public buildings, were more than monuments, they were practical tools that tied provinces to the capital and each other. Picture a modern highway network. The faster and safer the routes, the easier it is to deliver goods and services, and the more attractive a place becomes for investment and settlement. Cultural and legal legacies also run deep. Patronage of poets and architects raised standards and created works that shaped Roman identity for centuries, while legal reforms and clearer administrative practices fed into a body of law and custom that later societies would study and adapt. Roman legal concepts like contracts, property rights, and the idea of a written, consistent legal framework influenced the way later European legal systems developed. In simple terms, they helped make the rulebook clearer for citizens and rulers alike. Coins, monuments, and rituals promoted a common set of values and symbols, turning diverse peoples into a more cohesive social fabric, somewhat like a national flag or anthem helps a modern country build a shared identity. The model of imperial rule Augustus established became a template for later emperors and even distant rulers who admired Rome's blend of authority and administrative skill. Monarchs and statesmen looked to the Roman example when creating their own systems of centralized control supported by professional administrators. In everyday terms, it's similar to a successful business model being copied across industries. When something works, others try it. The balance Augustus struck between maintaining traditional forms and introducing efficient centralized governance proved adaptable enough to influence governance long after Rome's political center shifted or its borders changed. Finally, many practical innovations, public fire brigades and police forces in the city, regular censuses for fairer taxation, and an emphasis on public amenities, changed how urban life functioned and set expectations for what government should provide. People began to expect public safety, orderly streets, and services that made city living possible. That reshaping of expectations is a legacy that still matters. Modern states are judged by their ability to provide basic services, just as people in Roman times judged their rulers by roads, grain, and public order. A little stability and a few good roads can change a society's prospects, and Augustus's reworking of Rome's political and administrative machinery did exactly that for centuries to come. Augustus started as a clever survivor and ended as the man who quietly turned a chaotic republic into an orderly empire. He beat his rivals, kept the old institutions like the Senate around, but made sure real power rested with him. Think of it like a CEO who keeps the company name and board but runs the day-to-day. He reorganized the army, reformed taxes so Rome could actually pay for things, rebuilt roads, ports, and public buildings, and gave the empire a long stretch of peace and stability, the famous Pax Romana, basically a long, relatively calm period without constant war. Small changes, big effects. Better roads meant trade moved faster, cleaner food supplies meant fewer stomach aches, and public works made city life more livable, like fixing a messy neighborhood so everyone benefits. Augustus's legacy is mixed but huge. He brought order and lasting institutions, set a model for rulers to come, and showed how leadership can reshape a whole world. You might spot echoes of his tactics in modern leaders, CEOs, or city planners, same tools, different times. If you enjoyed this look at the man who built the Roman Empire's blueprint, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Coming up, a deep dive into Tiberius and the early Julio Claudians, and a closer look at everyday life in ancient Rome, from bakeries to bathhouses. Tell us in the comments, which reform of Augustus would you want in your city, better roads, safer streets, or free public baths?